For a brief time, there was one person who seemed to see me differently, my Aunt Margaret. She would lean over during family gatherings, whispering encouragement. "Don't stop drawing, Evelyn. You have something special." Her words were like tiny sparks in the darkness, but even she eventually faded away, choosing silence over conflict. When my parents openly dismissed me, she sat still, her lips pressed tight, and I realized then, silence can wound as deeply as words. The turning point came when I was 18. While my family celebrated Lillian's acceptance into business school with balloons and cake, my decision to study architecture at a community college was treated like rebellion. My father's disappointment was sharp as a blade. "You've thrown your future away." My mother muttered about shame, her eyes avoiding mine as though I had tainted the family name. That night, at my grandmother's house where everyone gathered, not a single person asked me why I chose architecture. No one cared that buildings had been my sanctuary since childhood, or that designing gave me a sense of purpose. They had already decided who I was, a cautionary tale, a living reminder of failure. From then on, the exclusions began quietly, almost casually. One Thanksgiving, I arrived at my parents' door only to be told everyone was at Grandma's. I drove across town, only to find the table full, my chair conspicuously missing. My mother later admitted, her voice cold, "It was easier not to invite you. People talk, Evelyn. We didn't want the embarrassment that became the pattern for a decade." Holidays came and went without me. Social media posts showed smiling faces, champagne glasses raised, Lillian at the center of every photograph. I watched from afar like a stranger peering through glass, aching for a family that had already decided I didn't belong. But here's the thing. Pain can either break you or build you. And while I often cried myself to sleep, clutching the sketches they mocked, I also began to learn something crucial. Their rejection gave me freedom. I no longer had to measure my worth against their impossible standards. I could fight for my own dream, even if no one believed in it. Looking back now, I see it clearly. My family's favoritism wasn't just about loving Lillian more, it was about making me invisible. That invisibility shaped me into someone who would one day rise beyond their reach. And so, standing in the doorway years later with their faces staring at me, trembling, I realized they hadn't come to make peace. They had come because they needed something. And for the first time, I wasn't the forgotten daughter. I was the one holding all the power. The years of silence from my family could have destroyed me. There were nights when it nearly did, but if you've ever been pushed so far into the shadows that no one sees you anymore, you'll understand this. Sometimes in the quiet, you find a strange kind of freedom. At 19, while my sister Lillian thrived in business school, I was scrubbing dishes in a cafe during the day, hauling bricks on construction sites in the evening, and studying architecture late into the night. My hands blistered and calloused, my body sore from work that was never meant for someone so slight. And yet, in those long hours, something inside me grew stronger. Every insult my father had hurled, every sigh of disappointment from my mother, became fuel. I remember standing in the dust of half-demolished houses, sweat dripping into my eyes, whispering to myself, "One day." My name is Evelyn Hart, and I'm 34 years old. For most of my life, I believed family meant love, protection, and belonging, but the truth I've learned is far darker. Sometimes the people who should love you the most are the very ones who erase you completely. 10 years. That's how long I lived, as though I were a ghost in my own bloodline. 10 years of being cut out of reunions, of empty chairs at holiday dinners where my presence was too inconvenient for them to bear. My name was no longer spoken in the house where I grew up, as if I had died, and they had chosen never to grieve. And then, one quiet Sunday morning, I opened the camera on my security system and froze. Standing at my gate were the very people who had cast me aside, my parents, my younger sister, and the relatives who once laughed at my failures. 10 years of silence, and now, suddenly, they had the nerve to show up at my mansion, built from the very dreams they mocked. That moment shook me to my core, because it proved something I think many of you already know. People don't always return out of love. Sometimes they return only out of need. Have you ever felt that sting? The heartbreak of realizing the ones you sacrificed for, the ones you long to belong to, can treat you as disposable until your success becomes convenient for them? If you've ever carried that silent wound, I want you to know, you are not alone. Please leave a like, share your story in the comments, and subscribe. Because when we share our scars, others know they don't have to walk through theirs in silence. As I stood by the door, my hand on the brass handle, I felt every scar of those years rise up. The Christmas mornings alone, the birthdays I cried through quietly, the day I sat outside a hospital room with flowers only to be told I wasn't family enough to be let in. Those memories came flooding back like a tide that no mansion, no wealth could wash away. But here's the value I want to leave with you. Rejection can break you, yes, but it can also shape you. What my family meant for abandonment became the fire that forged me. I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. I was a woman who built her life with her own blistered hands, a woman who no longer needed their approval to know her worth. And so, when I opened that door, I knew this wasn't just about their return. It was about my choice. Would I let the past define me, or would I finally take control of the ending to my own story? When I opened that door to my parents after 10 years, it was as if every buried memory came back to life. To understand why their return cut so deep, I need to take you back. Back to the beginning, where the wounds were first carved. I was born into a modest home in Houston. My father, Robert Hart, worked long days at a machine plant, his hands always stained with grease. My mother, Elaine, was a dental nurse, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, who believed discipline mattered more than affection. In their world, love was conditional. It had to be earned through achievement, through making them proud. My younger sister, Lillian, was their golden child. She had perfect grades, a cheerleader's smile, and eventually a scholarship to a prestigious university. At every family dinner, her accomplishments were toasted with pride. She was the crown jewel. And me? I was the failed experiment. From the time I was little, I found solace in sketching. While other kids memorized equations or practiced piano, I drew houses, scraps of wood glued into miniature models, cardboard castles balanced with tape and nails. To me, it was magic. To them, it was foolishness. My father would shake his head, muttering, "Dreams don't put food on the table." My mother would sigh, saying I was wasting my life on daydreams. The hardest part wasn't their words, it was the laughter of my extended family. I can still hear my Uncle Henry's voice, dripping with disdain at a Sunday dinner. If it weren't for Lillian, there'd be no one in this family worth being proud of. Everyone chuckled, glasses clinking. I smiled through it, but inside, that single line cut me deeper than anyone realized. I'll build something they can't ignore. It started small. Just me and 2 classmates from community college, Daniel and Rosa. They were dreamers too, though each carried their own scars. Daniel had grown up poor, his father gone before he could remember. Rosa was the daughter of immigrants, often told by teachers she wasn't cut out for more than clerical work. We found each other like lost souls orbiting the same fire. Together, we bought our first project, a rundown house that smelled of mold and disappointment. Everyone else saw ruins. We saw possibility. We tore out rotted floors, patched leaking roofs, and painted until our arms ached. The profit, when we sold it, was small, but to us it wasn't about the money. It was proof that our dreams weren't foolish. I can still remember the night we signed the papers and handed the keys to the new family. A single mother with 2 children, tears in her eyes, whispered, "This feels like a miracle." In that moment, I realized I wasn't just building houses, I was building lives, starting with my own. From there, project after project followed. Some failed, some barely broke even, but each time I learned. I learned how to negotiate with hard-nosed contractors, how to sketch designs not just for beauty, but for livability, how to see not just what a place was, but what it could become. By the time I was 25, I had saved enough to buy a stretch of land on the outskirts of Austin, land no one else wanted, weeds, brush, uneven ground. But I walked it at sunset and saw neighborhoods rising where others saw nothing. I built homes that welcomed light, homes that wrapped families in safety, homes that carried a piece of me in every beam and window. And as the houses grew, so did my reputation. People began to whisper about the young woman with relentless determination who poured her soul into every project. Articles followed, then magazines. My name, Evelyn Hart, became known in Austin's real estate circles. But through all the noise, what mattered most were the people beside me. Daniel and Rosa weren't just partners, they became family. We shared cheap takeout meals on unfinished floors, laughed at mistakes until our sides hurt, and stayed up past midnight perfecting blueprints. They showed me what family could mean when blood ties fail you: loyalty, presence, shared struggle. And there were others too, workers who started as strangers but grew into something more. Luis, a carpenter who taught me how to sand wood smooth as glass. Mary, a plumber who once showed up at midnight to fix a burst pipe and stayed until dawn. These were the people who stood by me, not out of obligation, but out of respect and bond. It was in those years I began to realize a truth I want to share with you. Sometimes the family you lose makes space for the family you choose, and yet even as I rose, there was always a shadow. Late at night, after contracts were signed and crews went home, I would scroll through social media and see the smiling faces of my blood family. Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas trees, birthday cakes, Lillian always at the center, my absence erased as neatly as if I'd never existed. That ache never fully left me. Success can build walls high and strong, but the longing for acceptance has a way of slipping through the cracks. By my early 30s, my life looked nothing like the girl my family had dismissed. I drove the same battered pickup, wore the same scuffed jeans, but I now oversaw developments that shaped entire neighborhoods. Newspapers wrote about the woman who rebuilt forgotten corners of Austin. Invitations to galas arrived, though I rarely went. None of it mattered as much as sitting at a table with Daniel, Rosa, and the crew, raising a glass not in pride, but in gratitude. Still, I never flaunted my success. Not once did I send word to my parents. Not once did I show up at their gatherings uninvited. Because I understood something. They had made their choice, and so had I. But life, I've learned, has a cruel sense of irony. Just when you've built enough strength to move past old wounds, those who inflicted them have a way of returning. Not out of love, not out of regret, but out of desperation. And on that quiet Sunday morning, when my parents stood trembling at my door, it was the weight of all these years, of struggle, of chosen family, of unhealed scars, that pressed down on me. This was no simple reunion. It was the beginning of a reckoning. When I think back to that Sunday morning, I remember the silence first. The kind of silence that presses against your chest, thick and heavy. My parents stood in my living room, their eyes roaming the chandelier, the walnut floors, the glass walls that opened to a garden they'd never been invited to see. My sister Lillian sat stiffly, her perfect posture cracking under the weight of her own troubles, and my aunts and uncle hovered near the doorway, as if unsure whether they belonged there at all. We spoke of small things at first, the drive, the weather, the furniture. But beneath every word, I could feel it, the real reason they had come. It was my mother who finally broke. She set her untouched coffee down and clasped her hands together, her voice trembling with a mix of practiced sorrow and expectation. "Evelyn," she said, "families should come together in hard times. Your sister is going through a divorce. The legal fees, the settlement, it's been overwhelming." Her voice trailed off, but her eyes stayed fixed on me, pleading. My father leaned forward then, his tone clipped but deliberate, as though trying to mask the desperation with authority. "Think of this as an investment. You've built something strong, Evelyn. If you help us now, it stabilizes everyone. It keeps the family legacy intact legacy. That word rang in my ears like a cruel joke. For 10 years, I had been erased from every birthday, every holiday, every gathering. But now, suddenly, they spoke of legacy, as if I were still part of theirs. Before I could respond, Lillian's boyfriend, a man I barely knew, decided to open his mouth. He adjusted his tie and said with an air of arrogance, "Family is family. If you have money, it's your duty to help. That's not optional. It's obligation." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Here was a man who had never seen me work 3 jobs to keep a roof over my head, who had never watched me scrub floors until my hands bled, daring to lecture me about duty. But as I sat there, weighing my words, something else surfaced. Something darker. Because their desperation wasn't just about Lillian's divorce. It was my Aunt Margaret, the very one who used to whisper encouragement to me as a child, who let it slip. In a nervous whisper, as if she hadn't meant to speak, she said, "We had no choice. The bank was going to call in the loan." The room froze. I looked at her, my chest tightening. "What loan?" No one answered. My father's jaw clenched, my mother's hands twisted in her lap, and Lillian's eyes dropped to the floor. A wave of dread swept over me, and with it a clarity so sharp it hurt. I turned to my father, my voice steady but low. "What did you do?" It was my uncle who finally spoke, fumbling over the words. "Years ago, when your company first started making headlines, the family needed help. We, your parents, used your name on a loan. It was just paperwork. We thought it wouldn't matter. But now the payments..." My breath caught. They had used my name, my credit, my reputation, the very things I had bled and sacrificed to build, without my knowledge, without my consent. The first betrayal was being erased from their lives. The second was far worse, being exploited while I wasn't even in the room to defend myself. I leaned back, staring at the faces I once longed to see every holiday. "So that's why you're here," I whispered. "Not just for Lillian's divorce. You used my name. You put my future on the line, and now that it's crumbling, you come to me to clean it up." The silence that followed was unbearable. My mother's lips trembled, her eyes glistening. My father cleared his throat, searching for words that never came. And Lillian who had been their golden child, sat frozen, her fists clenched in her lap, pride choking her into silence. I felt something inside me shift then. For years I had carried the weight of their rejection like a wound. But this betrayal carved into me like a second scar, deeper than the first. I looked at them, each in turn, and spoke with a calmness that surprised even me. "Do you know what it feels like to be cast aside for a decade? To sit outside hospital doors? To be told you're not family enough? To watch your sister celebrated while you're erased from every memory? And now, after all of that, you dare to use my name, my work, my life, to patch your own mistakes?" No one met my eyes. Shame filled the room, thick enough to choke on. That was the moment I knew this was no reunion. It was an ambush, not out of regret, not out of love, but out of desperation and deceit. And the girl they once called a failure? She wasn't here anymore. In her place stood a woman who finally understood that family, if it betrays you twice, doesn't deserve a third chance. The truth hung heavy in the room. Their silence was louder than any confession. My parents sat there, hands trembling, eyes lowered, as if the floor might somehow absorb their guilt. Lillian's face was pale, her lips pressed so tight they turned white. I drew in a slow breath. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Calmness, I realized, could cut deeper than anger. "For 10 years, I began, did anyone ever call? Did anyone ask if I was eating, if I was safe, if I needed help? When I worked 3 jobs to pay for school, did anyone bring me a glass of water? When I showed up at the hospital with flowers after Mom's surgery, do you remember what I was told?" My mother's eyes filled with tears. I didn't let her look away. "I was told I wasn't family enough. I sat in a hallway for hours, waiting for a chance to see you unconscious. I left money on the counter, hoping it might ease the burden. You never said thank you. You never even acknowledged I was there. My words pressed on, steady, relentless. And when I quietly tried to help with Lillian's son's tuition, you returned the money. Not because you didn't need it, but because you didn't want it from me. From the daughter you called a failed experiment. The shame in the room was suffocating. My father's jaw clenched, but even he couldn't form a defense. I leaned forward then, my hands steady in my lap. And now you dare come here, after using my name to borrow money, after discarding me for a decade, and speak of legacy? Number. This isn't about legacy. This is about survival. Your survival. And you want me to clean up the mess. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the tick of the clock on the wall, each second pounding like a drumbeat. Finally, I reached for the tablet resting on the side table. With a few taps, the screen glowed to life. You want to know what legacy looks like? I asked. I turned the screen toward them. Year after year of financial records appeared, projects completed, neighborhoods rebuilt, profits reinvested. This, I said, is what I built with my own hands. Not a single dollar from you. Not a single word of encouragement. I swiped again. Photos filled the screen. Ribbon-cutting ceremonies at a children's hospital, smiling kids in brand new treatment rooms, thank you letters from doctors. This is where my money goes, I said, my voice trembling not with weakness, but with conviction. Into hospitals for sick children. Into scholarships for young men and women who want to work but can't afford the tools or the training. Into building futures for people who show up, who fight, who care. That is where my obligation lies. I let the images linger before meeting each of their eyes. Not to those who erased me until they needed my bank account. The words landed like stones in water, rippling through the silence. My mother wept quietly. My father's shoulders sagged as if under a weight he could no longer carry, and Lillian's pride collapsed into shame she could not hide. I sat back, a strange calm settling over me. For the first time in years, I felt no longing for their approval, only clarity. Family isn't blood, I said, my voice steady, final. Family is how you treat one another. And for 10 years, you made your choice. Now I'm making mine. The room went still. No one argued, no one protested, because deep down they knew it was the truth. The scrape of my chair against the floor was the only sound as I stood. Their coffee sat untouched, steam curling into the heavy air. I walked slowly to the door, each step echoing with the weight of years I had carried. My hand wrapped around the brass handle, polished and cold, and I turned it with deliberate calm. Sunlight poured in, harsh and unrelenting, casting their shadows long across my foyer. I looked back at them, my parents, my sister, the relatives who had chosen silence. For years I had longed for their approval. Now all I felt was release. This is my home, I said quietly. Not a rescue bank. Not a sanctuary for people who only remember me when they need something. If you came for money, you came to the wrong door. Their faces told the rest. My mother's tears fell silently. My father's shoulders slumped under a truth he could not escape. Lillian turned away, her pride broken into pieces too sharp to gather. One by one, they stepped into the blazing Texas sun, and with a final click, the door closed behind them. I leaned against it for a moment, breathing deeply. What I felt wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was something softer, something I hadn't known I'd been searching for all these years. Peace. That evening, I drove into Austin to meet the people who had become my true family, Daniel, Rosa, and the crew who had built not just houses with me, but a life. We gathered around a long table, laughter spilling over plates of food, glasses raised not in pride, but in gratitude. Daniel leaned over, smiling, and said, "Evelyn, we don't care how much you have. We just need you with us." Those words pierced deeper than anything my blood family had ever said. Simple, honest, real. And in that moment, I understood. Healing doesn't always mean stitching broken pieces back together. Sometimes it means walking away from what fractured you and finding where you truly belong. So if this story touched you, I invite you to reflect. Who is your chosen family? Who has shown up for you when blood ties failed? Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to hear more stories like this, and remember, you are never too old, never too broken to find the place where you truly belong.